Chapter 14. Better MacDonald drunk than Mackenzie sober. The Pacific scandal was something that not even John A. MacDonald's new Mounties could save him from. In 1873, a scandal erupted which became known as the Pacific Scandal, or as Dr. Charles Tupper called it, the Pacific Slander. MacDonald was bribed to board British Columbia with American money that was intended for the building of the railway. The Conservative Party had used the railway money from the U.S. to boost themselves in pro-liberal British Columbia before and also during the 1872 by-elections there in preparation for the 1874 general election. Eventually the scandal came to light and MacDonald was forced to resign over it. At the end of the specific scandal debate in the House of Commons, he gave the following quote: "I have fought the battle of Confederation, the battle of Union, the battle for this Dominion of Canada, and there does not exist a man who has given more of his time, wealth, personal abilities, intellect, and his intelligence, such as they may be, for the good of this new nation of the Dominion of Canada." This is a rather long quote from John A. Macdonald, and it also had the end of a 5.5 hour long speech given by himself in defense of what he had done, drunk and or sober, to cause the Pacific Scandal in the first place. For as Macdonald once said, "There are often times when I do things that are against my conscience, and which I know are wrong, but if I do not allow for human weakness, my party would throw me out of power, and those that took my place would manage things worse than I." In total, MacDonald's first term in office lasted just 6.5 years, from 1867 to 1874. So Samuel Taylor was also involved in the Pacific Scandal, as he took some $40,000 or $50,000 from it for a New Brunswick provincial election, but he kept his name off the documents, apart from a few letters here and there, so he sort of got away with it, in the end, all personally. British Columbia had joined Confederation in 1874 under the leadership of William Alexander Smith, who was better known today by his nickname of Amour de Cosmos, or Lover of the Universe. He was critical in bringing British Columbia into Confederation in 1871, as their premier at the time. This was in return for building a railway through the Rocky Mountains to Vancouver. The man who negotiated the deal was Sir George Cartier, and he had to go overland, a difficult thing to do in 1871, as there was not yet a railway. So Carter would have to take the train from Thunder Bay to Ontario, then take a steamship across Lake Superior, through the United States, across the prairies by wagon, after going through the Rocky Mountains, and finally, via more ox carts and horse-drawn wagons, he eventually came to Victoria, British Columbia. Once the negotiations began, Cartier convinced the astonished British Columbian politicians to join Confederation with Canada. He also said that, quote, "So you want a wagon train through the Rockies, gentlemen? Ask for a railway. We are building a country." This astonished the British Columbia politicians, who had thought it was impossible to rail a railway through the mountains in the first place. So with that, British Columbia became Canada's sixth province in 1871. Cartier also promised that the railway construction would begin in 2 years, but it would take 10 years to build a railway from sea to sea. Shortly after that, the Pacific Scandal caused Macdonald's government to fall by a vote of non-confidence. The new Prime Minister was appointed, and his name was Alexander Mackenzie. As Macdonald was at the very end of his term, Mackenzie had no choice but to call an election. The 1874 election was the first election in history to use secret ballots, and the voter turnout on election day was the highest in Canadian history at about 54%. Mackenzie ran easily in the election and defeated Macdonald by a landslide, but the Conservatives still controlled the opponent's Senate. That would be a problem for Mackenzie's government because they were Liberals. Cartier lost his seat in Montreal, which he had held since the late 1830s. He then suffered a breakdown and died in London, England in early 1874 of sheer mental, physical, and nervous exhaustion. He then worked himself to death for the good of the Dominion of Canada, and particularly for his people, the French Canadians in the province of Quebec. Cartier was only 55 years old when he died. Cartier's death had a major impact on Macdonald, who may have suffered some kind of breakdown himself. MacDonald had been an alcoholic since about the 1830s or early 1840s. It is not known exactly when he started, but it progressed more and more over time. Cartier was a chain smoker, meant that he would light one cigarette as the other went out. Now, Cartier had a drinking habit, he did not object to it entirely, and he was more than willing to be Macdonald's, quote, drinking buddy, as Macdonald sometimes called his close friends, and sometimes close relations, too. But although MacDonald liked to drink all the time, he could not stand smoking, especially indoors. This led to something rather peculiar between the two men. MacDonald would be careful what he drank if Cartier was careful what he smoked. For example, the more Cartier took to his smoking habit, the more MacDonald would take to his drinking habit. Cartier could not stand this after a certain point in time, so to get MacDonald to stop drinking, he would have to stop his smoking. In the end, one man corrected the other man's bad habits, somewhat anyway. Alexander Mackenzie was born in Scotland in 1822. When he came to Canada in 1842, he was already a stonemason. Mackenzie built part of the Rideau Canal, the Round Canal, and the Parliament buildings, as well as Fort Henry in Ontario, along with Rideau Hall, Stoneway House, and many other public buildings throughout Quebec and Ontario, most of which are still standing today, and in use too. This is a statement to how well Mackenzie could work with stone. He had a reputation for being a no-nonsense, stubborn, hard-working, frugal man with a working man's respect for everything. Mackenzie also had a reputation for being a member of the temperance movement, like Tilly. But he also found that it was a bit too radical for him, so he began to favor the extremely strict regulation of alcohol as opposed to making it illegal in Canada. He couldn't enforce the laws around alcohol, so he made it illegal nationally if he had done so. He also had the common touch and was a man of the people. After all, he himself came from an extremely poor working-class background. In fact, Mackenzie had spent most of his early life in extreme poverty, and he became the Prime Minister of Canada for 5 years. During his time as Canada's second Prime Minister from 1874 to 1878, Mackenzie had to deal with what was the second worst depression in Canadian history. This was something that Canada wouldn't see again until the worst part of the Great Depression in the 1930s. The depression that started in 1873 was the result of an economic panic and runs in the banks all across North America, as well as widespread unemployment, high taxation, and overwhelming debts and bankruptcy. The economic crisis resulted in the so-called Panic of 1873 and the ensuing stock market crash of 1874. The only thing Mackenzie could do to alleviate this crisis was to increase taxes and tighten monetary policy and become an extremely strict budgeter. Mackenzie also believed the railway was a waste of time and taxpayers' money, so he meant that the railway construction almost ground to a halt entirely between 1873 and 1878. In short, he thought the economy would sooner or later fix itself in some way, somehow. In Canada, the depression was even worse than it was in other places like the US. In fact, during Mackenzie's term, more people actually left Canada than entered. MacDonald was now in opposition, said, quote, Mr. Mackenzie, the people are voting with their feet. Can you not see that, Mr. Mackenzie? Mr. Mackenzie was the only Prime Minister of Canada between 1867 and 1920 not to have the title of Sir Alexander Mackenzie. He thought that it would make him appear as something he was not. He wanted to appear a man of the people or a working man's politician. So Mackenzie refused being in it 8 times during his lifetime until he died plain old Mr. Alexander Mackenzie in 1892, aged 70. Mackenzie, although very happily married to his wife, did not have any kids that survived infancy or childhood. He also even supervised the building of a Stoneway House, as well as repaired 24 Sussex, Parliament Hill, the Parliament buildings, and the very first Supreme Court building as well as Rideau Hall, while he was Prime Minister. He was an extremely keen interest in other building works, for he was Minister of Public Works. In fact, Mackenzie even had a tunnel system built so that he could get off Parliament Hill at night from his office without being seen to avoid questions from newspapers. He personally supervised the construction of a tunnel system himself. In fact, he may have actually worked on them in his spare time. But that is perhaps just a myth. Today the tunnels are a sort of sewer system for the whole of Parliament Hill. Alexander Mackenzie had also run Canada for 5 of its darkest, most turbulent years. He had done his best, but the times demanded much more, and there was only one other man for the people of Canada to turn to in the election of 1878, and that was Sir John A. Macdonald. In 1878, MacDonald got sick from drinking too much and threw up on stage while in debate with Mackenzie. He turned to Mackenzie and said, Your plans to native Canada make me sick. In 1874, the Pacific scandal meant that people were extremely eager to replace MacDonald with Mackenzie. But now in 1878, a new campaign slogan was, Better MacDonald drunk than Mackenzie sober. Or it was also sometimes put, Better Sir John A. drunk than in the opposition sober. In 1878, MacDonald, or the old chieftain as he was called by his firm militia comrades, was back. He would remain in office as Prime Minister of Canada for the rest of his life. When Mackenzie heard that he'd lost the election of 1878, he said that old Mr. Tomorrow was back. This was true, because MacDonald did indeed procrastinate so much and constantly, which seemed to be nothing to do with his alcoholism, maybe or maybe not. In 1878, Cartier and all but one of MacDonald's children were dead. The only survivor of all his children was a man named Hugh John MacDonald, who was a failure at everything, at least in his father's eyes. Further, he hadn't seen his son since 1857, and they would not see each other until 1891, 34 years later. In fact, by 1878, most of MacDonald's contemporaries were dead. Yet the oddest thing was that in spite of being in the opposite political parties, MacDonald and Mackenzie used to sometimes meet and discuss common challenges facing Canada and how best to tackle these challenges that they both faced as prime ministers.